God eftermiddag. När jag var universitetsstudent var min favoritsysselsättning att ligga och suva. Mitt universitet hade ett krav på att läsa ett utländskt språk. Om jag läste svenska så fick jag ha sovmorgon varje dag. Så till slut blev det 2 år av svenska lektioner. Denna presentation idag är det första tillfället under hela min karriär som jag fått njuta av min förmåga att tala lite svenska. Medan jag gärna skulle vilja fortsätta på det språk som Strindberg och Söderberg talade, så för att spara på era öron så kommer jag att fortsätta på engelska istället. That brought back memories. Yeah, it took 15 minutes to write, but 15 years to prepare. Hi, everyone. My name is August, and I'm a designer. And last January, I moved to California, to the San Francisco Bay Area, after living almost 10 years in Seattle, where I worked for Microsoft, most recently as the Director of User Experience for Surface, which was some of the early strides in natural user experience. And I'm going to talk a bit about NUI today. And also, my last role there was leading part of the design team for Win8, particularly around Metro. My contribution was the authentically digital part of it. Anyway, now I work for the illustrious Korean company Samsung, which just opened a brand new user experience center in sunny and warm Silicon Valley, where I'm working on a secret project that involves visual displays. Working in this area, I started analyzing my own habits as a television viewer. And when I thought back to my childhood, I thought about which television programs I liked to watch. And as a kid, I liked watching cooking programs and an American children's show called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and the evening news. And I wondered, well, this seemed like a really strange collection of shows that I liked. But the thing I found that they all had in common was the shows all addressed the viewer. And in a way, this was like a first step to interactivity with the content. And thinking about the television shows that I like as an adult, there's shows like Top Chef and Project Runway and some lower brow fare like Jerry Springer and Judge Judy, and yes, I'll admit it, American Idol. I wondered why I liked all of these shows. And a few weeks ago, actually a few months ago, as I was watching American Idol, I noticed I was fast-forwarding through all the music and getting to the part that I liked. And the thing that all these shows have in common is there's always some form of critique. And in looking at critique, the reason why I enjoy watching critique is because it exposes the values of the judges, and it also shares a lot of different critique styles and the language of each of those professions. And one word that keeps popping up in a lot of these shows during the critique portion is the word modern. Now, the thing about this, especially someone who's studied design, is that the use of that word modern is overused and a lot of times misused. In the United States, on National Public Radio, there was a segment that actually attacked the use of the word modern for these shows. And the head of the English department at Johns Hopkins University, Douglas Mao, said that modern doesn't mean a tiki bar that's put together for $100 on a home and gardening network for Design Star. In fact, it's kind of debilitating to use the term modern for a dress made out of coffee filters when it's really referring to the likes of Pablo Picasso and Ezra Pound and Frank Lloyd Wright and yes, Strindberg and Soderbergh. The problem is that the word modern and the word contemporary is used interchangeably. And this may be cringeworthy to some, but technically it's not wrong. It's just surprising, especially when it's used among people who've ostensibly had educations in the history of art and design. Mao continues that modern bespeaks the early 20th century interest in a certain kind of pared-down aesthetic, a certain kind of difficulty, a certain kind of challenge, a certain kind of deep interest in originality. Which brings me to my final months in Redmond. During those months, a term kept popping up all over campus, and it was a term called modern UI. And we were faced with this kind of bifurcation as well, where most of the people, when they said modern UI, referred to a contemporary UI. But in fact, there was a few of us, a very small number, that were actually thinking, what does it mean to have a modernist UI? And so I used this as an alibi to embark on a quest and to pursue the modern or the modernist UI. And like in any hero's journey, I encountered a sage, a guru, and in this journey, it was a guy named Massimo, and here I am at one of his workshops. And this is a guy named Massimo Vignelli. For those of you who don't know, he's this living design legend. One of his claims to fame is he brought Helvetica to the United States, literally in a suitcase back in the 50s. And even if you might not be familiar with him, you'll be familiar with his work. And one of the common things about his work is that once he does a piece of work, it's there to stay. And the reason why I chose him is he is the designer that did all the signage and the identity system for the New York City subway. And part of it is all his work seems very timeless. It never seems out of date. And so when I met him, I tried to understand his secret to creating these kind of timeless designs. And we had a very life-changing conversation. And I have to give you a warning that whenever I talk about this conversation, it sounds like I've completely made it up. But here it goes. So I was at one of his private workshops on the French Riviera in the middle of the summer. And we took a day trip to the Provençal town of Grasse. And Grasse is the town where they grow all the flowers for the entire French perfume industry. So the air was literally perfumed with these flowers. And we were sitting in the sidewalk cafe talking about design. And it was there at that moment that he unveiled the secret of timeless design. And even though it felt like he was revealing a secret or bestowing a gift, afterwards it actually felt more like he was casting a gauntlet. That his challenge to me was to further the values of modernity, those of objectivity and purity and timelessness, into the digital age. So this is what I'm going to share with you. There's only one problem. It's very complicated. But I believe complexity is in the eye of the beholder. So here it is. This is his secret to timeless design, to the modern UI in verbatim. Design should be semantically correct, syntactically consistent, and pragmatically understandable. I told you it was really complicated. See, if we were a gathering of superheroes, my superpower would be the ability to explain really complicated stuff like this. So my goal for this talk is to explain 3 principles of his secret to timeless design in a way that's practical and accessible. And I'm wrapping this all up in a package that I call the New Modern. So to begin this explanation, I'd like to talk about zombies. So let me take a quick poll. Just by show of hands, have you ever thought, even for just a few seconds, what your zombie apocalypse plan might be? Anyone? Yeah, see, this is interesting. This is interesting. So it's not so much interesting that we're thinking about those, but what's interesting is, why is this a non-zero number? Especially in the 21st century. And some cultural critics suggest that this motivation is political, that zombie apocalypse represents a kind of collective fear. And if you happen to lean politically to the left, zombies are like the embodiment of everything left-leaning people fear, because they're mindless consumers, they stamp out nonconformists, and zombies cannot think for themselves. And don't worry if you lean to the right politically, the way your collective fears are embodied are through vampires, because they're often portrayed as immoral sexual deviants who tend to be foreigners, and by very definition, they're parasites. In fact, there was one sociologist in the United States that drew a correlation between the number of vampire movies and zombie movies during a given president's term in office, so that when Obama is in office, vampires are all the rage. And when Bush was in office, we had zombie movies like 28 Days Later and so forth. But what's interesting to think is zombies as a cultural phenomenon, as a piece of cultural analysis, are a fairly recent thing. They only started appearing in the late 19th century, and they gained popularity in 1968 with the movie Night of the Living Dead. Now, there's an interesting subtext about zombies, and it's this. It's that civilization is fragile. That one day, you're walking to work, drinking your coffee, and the next day, you're boarding up your house, loading a shotgun. Further, what's interesting is zombies represent something that's neither living nor dead. They're this kind of hybrid that are both living and dead. And they also represent a kind of ambiguity. And vampires do too. And if you think of a traditional vampire story, the resolution of a vampire story is to kill the vampire and symbolically end the ambiguity. It's to force a decision to return to a state of stability. And cultural critic and philosopher Slavoj Žižek says that we often find references to our cultural psyche in the way that relationships are portrayed in popular media. So, when we look at vampire stories in the 21st century, it's no longer about vanquishing the vampire. It's no longer about killing the vampire, but it's about living with them or living among them. And this is the big idea of today. In the 20th century sense of modern, we once fought change and strove for a sense of stability. But today, we must do the exact opposite. That we must embrace ambiguity and constant change. And as our popular media tells us, in doing so, we might even find peace, joy, and happiness. And so this is the first step of the new modern. It poses the question, how do we design for constant change? Well, if we assume that things will change, then what is the constant? The constant is the relationship between the things. For example, motherhood. As every individual in the history of all of humanity had a mother. There's a diversity of mothers as there are people, but that relationship of motherhood is the same. And if you're a little confused, I'm about to explain. So let's look at these kind of relationships in 3 levels. The first level is, how does an idea relate to an object? In other words, we have an idea in our minds, and we see a phenomenon in the real world, and there's a relationship between the two. The second is, if we take that relationship, how do those relationships relate to each other? In other words, we think about the bonds between ideas and the natural world, and we think of that relationship. Well, there are relationships between both of those. And then if we go to a third step, and this is where it gets like the movie Inception, we think, well, how do those relationships relate to everything else? And they form this kind of fabric. So if we think about these 3 levels of relationships, we can apply fancy terms to them. The first, about objects and ideas, we'll call the semantic level. The second, the relationships of those, the syntactic. And the third, the pragmatic. And I'm going to touch on each of these. So let's talk about the semantic relationship. In English, we have the words river and stream. And if you look in a French-English dictionary, river is fleuve, and stream is rivière. Now, to a native English speaker, the way we distinguish a river and a stream is by size. The rivers are large, and streams are small. But to the Francophone, it's a slightly different distinction. It's about direction. That a fleuve flows into a large body of water, like a sea or the ocean. But a rivière flows into another rivière or a fleuve. So if Pierre and I are walking along in a creek, then we're in total agreement. This is a creek. This is a stream. It's a riviera. And if we're walking along the Indalselven, which flows into the Baltic, then we're in total agreement as well. This is a river or a fleuve. But the moment we turn the corner and we're walking along the Ameron, this is where things get kind of sketchy. Pierre and I are both looking at the same phenomenon, but in our minds, we have entirely different concepts of what we're seeing. And so the idea behind this is that the relationship between the concepts formed in our head and things we see in the world is entirely arbitrary, and that they're driven by consensus. And in this example, it's a consensus of speakers of a certain language. A smaller scale example of this exact same thing is if you and I were playing a game of chess and replaced one of the pieces with a salt shaker, we could still continue playing the game of chess without any sort of hindrance. But if someone comes along and sees the salt shaker that we're moving around on the table, they might think it's madness. But in fact, to us, it's still a game of chess. So what this suggests is that the salt shaker or the chess piece is not an either or, but the identity of that object, again, is drawn from a consensus. So it can be both a salt shaker and a chess queen. So this leads to the first of the three things that you should know. That the semantic relationship between an idea and an object is arbitrary, and it's driven by consensus. And so here's some implications around the design of software. This suggests that natural user interface is a misnomer. The relationship between a gesture and its intent is entirely arbitrary, that no gesture has innate meaning, and in fact, it's just driven by consensus. We agree that this is what it means, that this is Zoom, naturally. And that's what we mean by semantically correct. But then this raises the question, well, how do we drive consensus? And this brings us to the syntactic level. In talking about the syntactic level, I'd like to bring up the Kuleshov Effect. Lev Kuleshov was a Russian filmmaker in the early 20th century. He was a contemporary to Sergei Eisenstein, who did the battleship Potemkin. And they were both major figures in montage theory about the sequencing of film. And the Kuleshov effect is basically this, it's in a nutshell. Kuleshov took three pieces of film and put them in a sequence and showed them to an audience, and they drew the conclusion that the sequence meant meaning A. But then, when he swapped out only the second piece of film and showed it to another audience, that audience had a completely different interpretation of that sequence. A more eloquent and accurate portrayal of this is shared with us by Alfred Hitchcock.
Now the third way is what one might call pure cinematics, the assembly of film, and how it can be changed to create a different idea. Now we have a close-up. Let me show what he sees. Let's assume he saw a woman holding a baby in her arms. Now we cut back to his reaction to what he sees. And he smiles. Now what is he as a character? He's a kindly man. He's sympathetic. Now, let's take the middle piece of film away, the woman with the child, but leave his two pieces of film as they were. Now we'll put in a piece of film of a girl in a bikini. He looks, girl in a bikini, he smiles. What is he now? The dirty old man. He's no longer the benign gentleman who loves babies. That's the difference. That's what film can do for you.
Or you for it, as it were.
And this leads us to the second thing that you should know. The relationship itself has meaning. And this meaning is separate from the respective significance of each of the relatives in that relationship. And this is extremely powerful. I believe it's what Claude Debussy was referring to when he says that music is the space between the notes. And here are the implications of the syntactic relationship. That the syntactic relationship is a powerful design force, and this is the reason why video games generate such strong emotional responses. And that's a whole different talk all on its own. But I believe it's also the reason why natural user interface is so engaging, even though it's not the most productive way of doing things. See, in NUI semantics, they tap into this kind of primal fantasy that most humans have, which is the ability to manipulate matter with your mind. And so the moment that these manipulations generate some sort of significance, it becomes really addictive. And the nature of these relationships drive a kind of consensus. And if they're consistent, that's the kind of syntactic consistency that we're talking about. Which leads us to the third level, which is the pragmatic level. So if you ask any physicist, in any closed system, there's a quality of divergence. All closed systems diverge. And this quality is known as entropy. And even in closed systems such as 21st century society, things diverge, they break down, and they spread apart. And what we're seeing in the same kind of terms is a shift from centered models to decentered models. So it used to be in the 20th century, if you wanted to have a television program, that you'd broadcast one, that you had to have a television station. Now you and Rebecca Black and anyone else can just broadcast whatever you want on YouTube. And we're seeing the shift from centered models in different media to decentered models as well. Another way of thinking about this is we're shifting from vertical models to horizontal models. And we even see this in a very literal sense in user interface, where the verticality is represented by the scroll, but today it's all about the swipe. It's all about horizontality. And so here are the implications. The implications for society and design practice are this: that nonlinear development processes are on their rise. So are non-hierarchical organizations. There's the idea of a career ladder that when climbed seems really outdated, when in fact today it's more like a career is this path that you take in all sorts of directions. And the same is true with production methods as well. In fact, yesterday at the MIT Media Lab open house, Sepp Kamvar said that, he tweeted, that innovation doesn't come from the top down any longer. It comes from decentralization and the freedom to explore, which I believe is a model that's alive and well at the Media Lab. Well, the big implication for our community is a behavioral shift called bricolage. So bricolage, in its traditional sense, refers to a kind of do-it-yourself repair culture. A bricoleur in French is someone who would travel the countryside and go from household to household and perform repairs on things that needed to be fixed. And he or she would do the repairs with whatever was at hand. And so this is a term that means the creation of a work from a diverse range of things that just happen to be lying around, or a work created by this process. So when we look at phenomena like Facebook and LinkedIn and Spotify and Pinterest, this is a kind of bricolage. The people form their identities, they form these collections through whatever is at hand. And so these services actually offer up the building blocks for the end results of these processes. And this leads to the third thing that you should know. The new systems should allow us to construct meaning and identity with what is at hand in a way that we understand. So when we think about a smartphone, is it really just a phone? No, it's much more than a phone, but it's pragmatically understood. And so this leads us to the three things. The first is that relationships between ideas and objects are arbitrary. The second is that relationships themselves generate their own meaning. And the third is that systems are departing from these vertical centered models. So you must be asking yourself, well, so what? So the thing is, I'm going to answer a question with a question. Well, so what do architects do? And I'm talking about not software architects, but the Vitruvian kind. The common answer to this is that architects design buildings. Well, it's not true. If you ask an architect, he or she would argue that they create spaces. So when you ask an interactionist what he or she does, is it about designing interfaces? No, not really. In fact, it's more about creating a state of mind. Which brings me back to the summer of 2010 when the Deep Horizon disaster, the BP oil spill, was at its height. It got me to thinking about sustainability and design. And I came to the conclusion that sustainability went far beyond just the ecological. But it also included visual pollution and cognitive pollution and wastes of emotional energy. And the thing is, the part that's scary about this is in digital media, the ability to replicate and scale terrible experiences and these kind of distressing, even if they're little, these distressing experiences is the scary part because it's very subtle, yet the enormity is vast. So how do we fight this risk? Well, we must design systems that rein in the arbitrary bonds between thought and nature, that generate quiet but powerful meaning through the relationship of ideas, that allow people to construct identity and significance, however new, that are relevant to their respective lives and circumstances. In other words, design that should be semantically correct, syntactically consistent, and pragmatically understandable. And that is the new modern. Thanks for listening. So I was told to fill up the whole hour. I'm not going to fill up the whole hour. But I was told to reserve time for questions. But someone was telling me beforehand, don't expect anyone to ask questions, especially in a room like this. So I decided to prepare some questions for you that I was going to ask myself and answer for you. So the first question is, may I have a copy of this presentation? The answer is yes. Just send me a mail. I'll send you this presentation. The second is, do you have a blog or website? No, not yet. I don't want to put up a blog that I'm never going to update, so I'm only going to put one up when I have too much to say. But you can add me on Facebook. I throw things up there all the time. I subtly snuck in that we're hiring. Yes, we offer US visas. You just have to be really good at what you do. Why is Massimo Vignelli important? I'll answer that out in the hallway. So what am I reading nowadays? I have this intellectual crush on this guy named Jonah Lehrer. He has this new book out called Imagine How Creativity Works. That's what I'm reading. What do apps look like in bricolage? This is interesting. Like today, when we think about an application, and it's this kind of very centered, very vertical model. Take Microsoft Word, for example. We're typing along and we're putting in text, and we want to turn something bold, then we highlight it and hit the bold button. In a kind of bricolage sense, what we would do is we take a text input app and a bold app and maybe a highlighting app and combine them together. And then in the text input, I would use my highlight app to highlight the word and use my customized bold app to bold it. So that's an example of a bricolage app model. And then the last question is, isn't this just post-structuralist linguistics? Yeah, but that doesn't make an exciting talk subject. So that's it. Thank you. And I think I'm ending really early. So I'll show one more thing. And this won't take that long. But this is an animation from the makers of South Park. And they animate lectures from the theological philosopher Alan Watts. And so this is kind of related to all these talks, but you're going to have to take a quick leap to see how it's related to the ideas that I presented. So here it is.
In music, one doesn't make the end of a composition the point of the composition. If that were so, the best conductors would be those who played fastest. And there would be composers who wrote only finales. People go to concerts just to hear one crashing chord, because that's the end. But we don't see that as something brought by our education into our everyday conduct. We've got a system of schooling which gives a completely different impression. It's all graded. And what we do is we put the child into the corridor of this grade system with a kind of, come on, kitty, kitty, kitty. And yeah, you go to kindergarten, you know. And that's a great thing, because when you finish that, you'll get into first grade. And then, come on, first grade leads to second grade, and so on, and then you get out of grade school, and you go to high school, and it's revving up, the thing is coming. Then you're going to go to college, and by Jove, then you get into graduate school, and when you're through with graduate school, you go out to join the world. And then you get into some racket where you're selling insurance. And they've got that quota to make. And you're going to make that. And all the time, this thing is coming. It's coming. It's coming. That great thing, the success you're working for. Then when you wake up one day about 40 years old, you say, my God, I've arrived. I'm there. And you don't feel very different from what you always felt. And there's a slight letdown because you feel there's a hoax. And there was a hoax. A dreadful hoax. They made you miss everything. We thought of life by analogy with a journey, with a pilgrimage, which had a serious purpose at the end, and the thing was to get to that end, success or whatever it is, or maybe heaven after you're dead. But we missed the point the whole way along. It was a musical thing, and you were supposed to sing or to dance while the music was being played.
That's the real end. So go out and sing and dance. Thank you.